Hello, listeners, and welcome to Setting the Record Queer. This is Minisode 1, Sounding the Research Queer. My name is Kaylee, and my pronouns are she, her.
Hi, my name's Alexis. My pronouns are it, its, and she, her.
So, when you're listening to this, we will have just gotten back from Awesome Games Done Quick, and as a result, we did not have time to do a full normal episode. So this is going to be a little taste into something that Alexis has worked on over the past couple weeks. We will be doing a live episode there, so if you didn't have a chance to watch that, it might be up on YouTube already, I'm not actually sure, but it might be in the audio feed of this podcast. I don't know the timing on those, or if one of those will happen.
They'll be up soon, TM.
Anyway, make sure to stay excited for our next full episode. We will be having on Olive Brinker, creator of Ray the Doe.
Oh my god, I'm so excited.
Me too.
I love Ray the Doe. It's so funny and queer and anti-capitalist. It's perfect. I'm so excited.
All right, Alexis, why don't you talk about what you've done?
Oh, I've really done it now, Kaylee. I've really done it now. I accidentally turned plural. Wait, that's not what this podcast is about. Over the course of wrapping up the school semester this year, one of the classes I was in this semester was basically a class on the history of recorded sound. And for this class, we got free rein to write a paper on anything, really. And so, as I tend to do with these free topic papers, I basically pushed it to the absolute limits. So I wrote a paper, it was 20 pages long, and it was called Nintendium Philharmonic, The History of Sound of Nintendo Gaming Consoles, from the Famicom to the Wii. And now this was basically a sweeping historical academic review of the sound capabilities of every Nintendo console from the Famicom to the Wii. It started out as just a paper, but honestly, it turned into this big passion project that I just poured my heart and soul into for a couple weeks. So what was really neat about this project was it started, like I said, it started as just a paper. But then the more I got into it, the more it became something I felt like I almost had to do. It quickly became something that felt important in a number of different ways. So first of all, as far as I can tell, no one has ever done what I've now done. There is no single source that has as much information about these consoles' audio capabilities as what I've put together, and especially not one that actually has that information in an accessible way. A big difficulty with this project was that information was basically either a Wikipedia level summary or literally a homebrew development wiki with full ROM and memory maps and almost no in between. So a big part of the project was starting with that Wikipedia summary and then diving into those ROM data maps and coming out with something that the average person can probably read and understand. And safe to say, no other, school paper I've ever written has required this much research. I went in really deep because, like I said, there wasn't a lot of information, not even just in good forms. There really wasn't a lot at all. And what I did have primarily came from, homebrewers, ROM hackers, emulator developers, so on and so forth. And, as this project went on, it sort of turned into this oh God, the fact that we have no historical recording of the audio technical capabilities of these consoles is kind of horrifying. And especially in an age where Nintendo is regularly threatening emulator sites out of existence and shutting down homebrew projects, these historical and archiving projects are just becoming more and more important as time goes on. So yeah, safe to say, I had a good time with this project. I had a really, really good time. So for this mini-sode, Sounding the Research Queer, I'm just gonna talk a little bit more about all of the neat things that I learned. So I picked out a couple little factoids from the paper that I thought were relatively interesting. So I'm gonna go through these. So one thing that was a trend that I discovered throughout the entirety of this paper is that really this whole development over the course of 23 years of consoles was just ingenuity in the face of limited memory. The difficulties on the NES for creating sound were not due to, limitations of channels or technology. It was really only that there just wasn't enough space to store music. So on the NES, you had to write music in, numbers. Calling up waveforms. And it took literally all the way until the Wii in 2006 for you to just be able to put a recorded song file on a disc and call your audio project done. So there are a couple smaller things that I, learned along the way that I thought were at least kind of interesting to me, a total audio dork. So let's go through them. So the first thing was from our very first console, was the Nintendo Entertainment System. The Nintendo Entertainment System has 5 analog audio channels, but the one that caught my eye the most was the way it does noise generation. Now, for those of you unfamiliar with audio, noise is a waveform that essentially sounds like, percussion, like that sort of thing. What noise is, when you actually look at it, is essentially random movement, because it doesn't have a particular frequency. It's just kind of, it's television static. It's whooshing, wishing, snare drum, whatever sound. So when you're on a console like the NES, I already said that memory was real tight. So they had to have some sort of system to generate this randomness without requiring much data stored. And so what Nintendo developed to do this was, to drop the technical jargon, a 15-bit linear feedback shift register. And so what this thing essentially did was, going to try to avoid programmer terminology here. You have 15 slots that can either have 0 or 1. You start with all of them being 0. Then on every increment, you check 2 of the values. If they're different, you put a 1 before the beginning, then you shift everything over 1, so that number you just popped up, sometimes a 1, sometimes a 0, enters at the beginning. And then this cycle continues to, generate a new number, shift it over, check, generate a new number, shift it over. And what was also cool is that with settings on the NES, you could actually choose what 2 values were being compared to get different forms of noise, whether you get a more like static sound or something like a metal clanky tonal sound. And I thought this extremely simple, robust analog technology to generate randomness was just really, really fascinating. If you want to learn a little bit more about that device, you can check out proto.ml/lfsr. As part of the project, I actually wrote an emulation of this little hardware bit in C, which was pretty cool. I got to learn some bitwise math. And if you want to hear this thing in action, you can check out Fireman Song from Mega Man 1, which uses both noise modes and rapid alternation. Cool. So the next thing I want to talk about is the secret sound channel on the Nintendo Game Boy. That's right. There is a sound channel on the Game Boy that nobody's ever heard of. And by nobody, I mean not that many people. So the Nintendo Game Boy had 4 sound channels instead of the NES's 5. I just lied to you. It actually had 5. The 5th sound channel on the Game Boy was never used by any game that was ever released. And that's just wild to me. It's a common trend in the way Nintendo likes to develop. They'll leave room for expansions and stuff like that. But still, there's just an entirely unused sound channel. So what this sound channel was essentially a, plug in for an analog sound signal from the cartridge. So, the cartridge could have extra sound stuff on it. And like I said, no game ever used this, but what did use this is a neat device I found called the Nano Loop Mono, which is a sequencer and analog synthesizer Game Boy game. You plug it in like a Game Boy cart, and you use the Game Boy to control the sequencer, and it is a full analog synthesizer on a chip. And it actually sounds like a big budget synth. It was just a really, really cool thing to find. And it just kind of calls back to that, the way that these audio technologies have been recorded and celebrated has been entirely thanks to the work of, people who care, not big companies. So that one was really, really, it was an exciting find. It was what do you mean there's 5 channels on the Game Boy? There's 4 channels on the Game Boy. All right, and the final nice little factoid I want to talk about here, this is something I think you'll enjoy, Kaylee. Kaylee, if you can help me out here, actually. So I think we both agree that the Game Boy Advance has a really iconic and memorable sound. Kaylee, can you describe that sound to me?
No.
Okay, fair enough. I would call it tinny and buzzy, but anyways, that's not really the point. The Game Boy Advance has a really iconic sound, and as I was doing my research on what exactly the Game Boy Advance was capable of, I actually more or less was able to piece together why the Game Boy Advance sounds the way it does, why it has such a distinct tone. So the Game Boy Advance has 6 audio channels. The first 4 are a clone of the 4 standard channels from the original Game Boy, because if you ever had a GBA, you probably know it can play original Game Boy games. So you have that set of analog audio channels. What the Game Boy Advance brought to the table that was new were 2 channels to play back extremely low resolution digital samples. And so first of all, low resolution digital audio has a very distinct tone just because of it being low resolution digital audio. But you combine that with the, memorable sound of analog waveforms, and you get this very unique combinational tone of like analog warmth and digital harshness. And then the way the Game Boy Advance outputs audio is really interesting. So in digital audio, back up. In analog audio, you have a waveform that is continuous in terms of, going across and going up and down. It is, you can zoom in on it infinitely and it just keeps going, down to some like quantum physics level, but I'm not that smart. Digital audio doesn't work like that because storing infinitely precise data on a computer is a terrible idea. So what digital audio does instead is give you essentially two parameters. You have your sample rate, which is basically how often we're checking where the waveform is, and your depth, which is essentially how many possible heights of the waveform there can be. So what the Game Boy Advance does to output audio, it processes the audio at a high depth and low sample rate, but then outputs it at a low depth and extremely high sample rate. Actually, the sample rate is the same as the console's clock speed. It uses a technique called pulse width modulation, which essentially what it does is it approximates the high depth value as the average of like 500 only zeros or ones. This is the same technique you see in a lamp that has multiple brightness settings, as a fun fact. But because of the way that pulse width modulation sound affects like the capacitors of your Game Boy, that also adds a layer of that like distinct sound. So that's why the Game Boy Advance has the sound it does. So yeah, like I said, this has been a really, really exciting project for me. I hope you enjoyed my little ramble. So I do have some plans for actually publishing this project. In the short term, I'm going to be publishing a slightly modified version of the paper up on, some link on my personal website, proto.ml. Keep an eye on my Twitter. I'll talk about that when I do it. I don't know if it'll be up before or after AGDQ. In the long term, I'm planning to turn this into a bigger project where I'm going to be writing a series of individual articles per console. With a much higher focus on accessibility, trying to really start from literally nothing about audio, but I'm going to teach you everything. Okay, so that's all I have to say about my little project that I've been kind of obsessed with recently.
Well, thanks everyone for joining us for our little minisode. Apologies for not having a full episode this week, but we will be back next time with a full episode. You can support us on Patreon at patreon.com/settingtherecordqueer. You can follow us on Twitter at strqueercast, and you can join our Discord at bit.ly/strqcord. Our logo was made by Cubotic, that's at QBTIC on Twitter or cobot.tumblr.com, and our theme music was made by Thrill Me Music, who you can find at thrillmemusic.squarespace.com. See you all next time with Olive Brinker. Bye!